Greetings. Today's brief lecture is an introduction to the September-October LD topic that the member nations of the World Trade Organization ought to reduce intellectual property protections for medicine. This lecture is designed as a basic overview of the core arguments of the topic. It is meant for debaters who are beginners, who are novices, or debaters who debate on circuits where they just debate those core elements. There is a secondary lecture available it's much more comprehensive, and it covers all the arguments that are likely to be run that are in any way tangentially related to the topic on the national circuit. But let's begin by defining a few of the key terms. First of all, what is the World Trade Organization? The World Trade Organization is a multi-member body. It actually is composed of most of the countries of the world. That's designed to set some rules and norms that govern international trade. And international trade is really just simply the exchange of goods between countries. They've made some agreements related to particular things, and we'll talk more about intellectual property soon, about how they should trade with one another for some basic rules. As I mentioned, it includes almost every country in the world. This slideshow itself is available online, and you can click on that and you could see every country. And the resolution does say, to go back to the resolution, that the member nations of the World Trade Organization. Now, what is intellectual property right? Or intellectual property? Intellectual property, as noted, is a category of property that includes the creations of the human intellect. So we normally think of property as, just something you own, whether it's a computer, a car, a house, anything of that nature. But these intellectual properties are actually the intellectual creations of an individual. And there are four main types of intellectual property. The first is a patent, which is most of what this topic is going to talk about. A patent is a type of intellectual property that gives its owner the legal right to exclude others from making, using, or selling the invention. All right? And they get that right there, and they're the only ones who can distribute it. The second type in the resolution we'll deal with is a trade secret that has formulas, practices, processes, designs that have inherent economic value to the individual that created the invention. Then we also have that are really kind of less relevant on this topic as it applies to medicines, but it can be applied. Sometimes there are copyrights and there's certainly trademarks at issue. A trademark is a type of intellectual property consisting of recognizing a sign, design, or expression. Again, it's not really a core part of this debate, but it is related, right? We know that Pfizer and Moderna produce vaccines and they have their own branding and images, and that's a trademark. So even if somebody else gets a hold of their intellectual property, we might not want to let them, just kind of sell the product or sell a similar product under their name. So, in certain countries, sometimes we see somebody else will use the Starbucks name and they'll just sell a type of coffee that's not Starbucks. That would be a violation of the trademark. And then a copyright is simply an intellectual property that gives it the owner to make copies of a created work. So this lecture, for example, is copyrighted. If you go to the library, you find a book, you can find some quotes in it. That's considered like legitimate use, but you can't just go copy the whole book and put it online. That's a violation of its copyright. Now, as I mentioned, what we're going to talk about, what does this intellectual property have to deal with the World Trade Organization? Well, countries don't just trade in goods, they can also trade intellectual property. And to facilitate this, the World Trade Organization came up with the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property, also known as TRIPS. And what TRIPS does is it requires the WTO members, who I mentioned who are most of the countries of the world, to provide copyrights, and it gives some other things, but I'll highlight trademarks, trade names, confidential information, that this is going to be protected in international trade. So not just domestically in country, but in international trade as well. TRIPS also specifies that there are certain enforcement procedures, remedies, dispute resolution procedures. Protection and enforcement of all intellectual property rights has to meet the objectives to contribute to the promotion of technology transfer and the transfer and dissemination of technology. Now, under TRIPS, companies and an individual, if that's relevant, have this intellectual property, this protection of intellectual property rights for 20 years, at which point the property normally just goes into the public domain. But that's why this is relevant. That's what the framers of the resolution were trying to get at when they wrote this resolution. I don't know if it necessarily does that, because it just says the member nations of the World Trade Organization should reduce their protection of intellectual property, right? Well, they could. It doesn't have to happen through the framework of the World Trade Organization, but this resolution does kind of bring up some is meant to bring up debates about essentially the World Trade Organization and TRIPS, and of course intellectual property rights generally. So it is important to understand that background. Now, what is the status quo as it relates to medicine and the controversy? Well, first of all, intellectual property protection does apply to medicine. If a company creates a new medicine, they're generally going to file for a patent, have a patent on that, and they have exclusive right to the distribution of that medicine. That production will usually involve some trade secrets. And of course, in their materials, they're going to have trademarks and copyrights. So I say that's like a less of a core element of the debate. We're really kind of mostly talking about patents and to some degree trade secrets. Now, this has become a current controversy because, the three major vaccine producers of COVID-19 vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, and J&J, they own patents. And, these are really the best vaccines in the world. I think everybody agrees on that. Other countries do have vaccines, right? There's a vaccine created by China and created by Russia. Now, those are considered a bit less effective, but importantly, they also have patents on those as well. So even though they're less effective, this is still an issue. So there's a big issue right now in the world about how are we going to get access, or how are other countries that haven't developed their own vaccines, maybe have even less effective vaccines, how are they going to gain access to these drugs that these major companies have patents on? And it's not that the companies wouldn't necessarily sell them the drugs, but the problem is that a lot of these countries, the developing countries, these poorer countries, they can't afford the drugs themselves. And of course, in some instances, we just have issues with production. It's hard for these companies to produce this many doses of the drugs. So there's a lot of this that comes up in the context of COVID-19. And if you look on the daily update we have on the website, a lot of that information is about that. But COVID-19 drugs are not the only issue. There's a big thing about HIV/AIDS drugs and the distribution to the developing world of HIV/AIDS drugs, and just drugs generally. Not so much even an access issue in terms of can people get access to the drugs, but can people afford the drugs, right? If somebody has a patent on a drug, if a company has a patent on a drug, and it's the only drug that really accomplishes what it's set out to do, then they can really kind of charge a lot of money for the drugs, or at least what a lot of people are willing to afford. So even before we had COVID-19, we had issues related to this. The companies having these patents, patenting this knowledge, then only distributing the drug for like a very high price. In terms of the resolution, the United States itself supports what's called a COVID waiver. The United States supports that the intellectual property protections on these drugs would be waived, or should be waived, so anybody can access the intellectual property that Pfizer and Moderna and J&J have on these drugs. But other countries in the world, there are other countries, and another country that supports this, a strong advocate of this, has been India. But other countries such as Germany, other Western European countries, the UK, and even in East Asia, Japan, really opposes this lessening of intellectual property rights protection. So currently, there is not a waiver on the distribution of these drugs. Now, there are other policies besides waivers, right? The resolution just says reduce protection for intellectual property rights. There's other ways that you could reduce the protection of intellectual property. You could say they only have it for 3 years. You could say that they have to, share it with more companies, but not just kind of make it openly available. Obviously, in LD, there's a little bit of a controversy, which we'll just talk about in a second. But generally, at least for the purposes of this lecture, we're going to kind of debate it as a whole. And I think you could give examples of the waiver, other types of things. There are some issues related to Lincoln Douglas that are controversies in Lincoln Douglas that we're, like, as I just mentioned, we'll bracket, that have come up, especially in circuit LD debate. So the resolution says member nations of the World Trade Organization. Okay, now what does the affirmative have to advocate? Do they have to advocate that all members reduce it? That seems like a lot. Do they have to? But can they only advocate one country? There's only over 100 members of the World Trade Organization, right? So you could say, like, China should reduce the intellectual property rights protections of a drug. Now and then, okay, as we say, right, medicines, right, just as reduce intellectual property protections of medicines. Can we pick a particular drug? So China maybe has a patent on a particular HIV drug, and we say, is it fair for the affirmative to say China should reduce that particular reduce intellectual property on that particular drug? And then, as I just mentioned, okay, well, there's differences. There's like a waiver. We can say there's no intellectual property. There's compulsory licensing. Compulsory licensing occurs when a country says, look, we're just going to take the intellectual property and we're going to make this drug available. India has kind of threatened to do this, to basically kind of reverse engineer the drugs and figure out how to produce it and just produce it and distribute it to everybody. They say this is justified in a national emergency. So we're not going to go into those details either. You can talk about, these, whether you have the affirmative in LD has to advocate for all or nearly all the countries or all or nearly all the medicines is kind of a perennial controversy in LD. But as I said, we're just discussing this generally. What are the basic affirmative arguments? As I mentioned, there are even more arguments. You can listen to the varsity lecture. There's even much larger list of arguments. But what are the key arguments? Well, the first of all is that we have to kind of distribute the drugs, right? Or people are going to die. If people don't get access to COVID-19 vaccines, they're arguably just going to, pass away. We see that in the United States, where I think it's, like 85% of the hospitalizations are people who have not been vaccinated. And I think it's 98 or 99, a really high percentage of the deaths are among unvaccinated people. And, of course, you have developing countries where you only have 1% to 2% of the people vaccinated. So you're going to have kind of some very high death rates. And of course, there is just, I'm talking about COVID-19, and I think it's a great example. But as I said earlier, before this even particular resolution was even announced, there's been a whole debate about the affordability just of drugs in general. And because companies can have these patents, these drugs can get very expensive. Now, there's also, of course, there's, obviously a problem with people in the developing world, poor people dying. But also that could kind of come back to, kind of haunt, so to speak, people in the developed world, especially the United States, right, is one of the highest, really has the greatest access to these drugs. That the more the virus spreads, essentially, okay, and even though it does spread amongst they were finding that it spreads amongst vaccinated people. It spreads for a longer period of time amongst unvaccinated people and more amongst unvaccinated people and stays in people's bodies longer, increasing the risk of a mutation. Now, we could get to the point where we have a mutation that kind of essentially overwhelms the vaccine, or that the vaccine doesn't generate, I guess I should say, an antibody response to. We've already seen this actually, potential for this, but they're kind of studying or looking out for, they call it a variant of interest, the MU mutation. And this mutation, if it kind of spreads widely, has the potential to essentially negate the vaccines. Related to this, we've had debate arguments about this in the past, is like bioterror or bioweapons. The argument is that there could be a lot biological weapons attack, and people need to be able to quickly develop new drugs to be able to respond to that. And in order to do that, they need to have access to the existing kind of intellectual property rights or intellectual property on these drugs. There also, of course, is this Lincoln Douglas debate, which was started at least to debate issues of morality. There's a kind of a basic moral claim that we should help people who otherwise can't afford to access medicine. You can make more kind of sophisticated arguments about this idea of distributed justice, that we should distribute resources in society more equally. There's arguments about Rawls's original position. John Rawls, who's a philosopher, the idea behind the original position is that if you were coming into the world, if you knew you were going to be born, but you didn't know what kind of social class essentially that you would be born into, what kind of world or what kind of policies would you want there to be in the world? And you could make the cases like, well, I'd want to make sure that I had access to this drug. Now, in terms of negative arguments, again, some basic arguments, the real core reason that we protect intellectual property is that drug development is very expensive. And it requires people, in most instances, to invest in these companies and into these drugs in particular, and then to kind of not only get their money back essentially over time, right, as they sell the drug, but also to make a profit. If you're an investor, you're not going to choose to invest in a company that's not going to turn a profit, and certainly you're not, and even then you're not going to invest in a company if there's another company or business available that can generate a higher profit. And without investors, we're not going to have new drugs, right? Even maybe new COVID-19 drugs that we potentially need to kind of fight off these new variants. We may not have drugs for other diseases. We move for like Alzheimer's or cancer generally, or different types of cancers, for gene editing, which is kind of a new thing in medicine and research, where they're actually starting to edit people's genes to help overcome a lot of these problems. And of course, as I mentioned too, for bioterrorism, biodefense. So that's really like kind of the core negative argument, and I think it's a good argument. And there's a pretty good debate about it. We have a lot of evidence on our website about that, obviously. Then there's arguments related to the economy. Okay, that these biotech companies just generally, that they're an important sector of the economy and that they need to make a strong profit. And when they're dominant in the world, this helps even protect the value of the US dollar. In terms of philosophical arguments, there are some value objections, right? You could say, hey, the property rights, there's this kind of whole strand of philosophical argument related to the protection of property rights. In other words, right, like, even if I have something you need, you can't just kind of come in my house and take it. All right, that is a violation of the just kind of common sense in a way, to a degree. I guess it's a little debatable in the way we live in our society, right? You can't just come in and take something and give it to somebody else. And if this is my property or my intellectual property, it should be protected, and shouldn't be the role of the government to go in and kind of redistribute wealth, redistribute property, to take my property and give it to somebody else who maybe needs it. And then, of course, we have a basic utilitarianism, which is basically kind of the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, in terms of kind of answering some of these arguments, again, I'm just going to look at like some core answers. So answering drug distribution and morality, you can say the status quo solves, that some of these drugs are given away by charity or charitable foundations. We also have distribution mechanisms. There's a COVAX agreement to support a COVAX, which I guess is just, co-vaccination, to share and distribute these vaccinations and to help other countries gain access to them. There's a pretty good argument on the con that the developing countries, right, even if they were to gain access to the drugs, access to the intellectual property, even the drugs themselves, they're kind of, even the ones that are just given away, that they're like struggling to distribute them. That they don't really have the supply lines to distribute these drugs. They don't have kind of the supply lines and established in a way that makes it possible to, a lot of these drugs have to be stored in a particular way at a particular temperature. You could also say that they don't have any means to kind of manufacture the drugs. Even if they had the intellectual property, they wouldn't necessarily have the means to manufacture it. And of course, innovation kind of basically turns all this argument, right? If the con wins the innovation argument, then maybe at least the best way get new drugs, maybe not to everybody, but at least to some people, which is better than nothing, okay, is to have some innovation in drug development. Then, of course, we have a counter value, right, of saying like, well, what is the greatest good for the greatest number? In terms of answering bioterrorism, you can say it's a very low risk. You can say innovation kind of turns the argument, right? If we need to have innovations to respond to bioterror, you can say that terrorists kind of would die trying to develop like these weapons, and that terrorists themselves really can't even like get a hold of the material. Now, let's look at how do we answer the con arguments. Okay, well, answers to innovations, you can say, well, we already have the drugs. Now, some of those drugs came about through innovations, but they're already there. So, at the very least, the negative can't turn the COVID-19 vaccine argument. The other kind of argument which I think is really strong is that, look, at the government, it's usually government grants. And in this case, we had, in the case of COVID, billions of dollars in government grants going into the development of these drugs. So it's not really the investors that are making these drugs possible. What's really making it possible is the money that the governments invest. You can also see that these companies, like, they don't need to make this much money. So if they didn't have patent distribution, all the drugs would not be necessary. And of course, they may, if they had lower profits, they may be forced to innovate. How to answer the economy arguments? You could say on the pro, well, look, if there's a spread of disease and mutations, that's going to kill the economy. You can say innovation turns this, right? If you win the innovation argument, then you win the economy argument. You could say it's bad to kind of focus on profit. Focusing on profit means inequality, disease, warfare, etc. How do you answer the cons property rights argument? Well, you can say if we protect too much intellectual property, we're basically protecting death, right? We're saying we're protecting your ability, my ability, if I own this, to deny the distribution of a drug that people need. You can also say that property is not really the most important thing that we necessarily want to protect in society, especially intellectual property, that, intelligence is generally hereditary. Property itself passed on from one generation to the next. It's not necessarily something that, it can be something that you earn, but it's not necessarily something that you earn. And, sometimes whether you end up with property or not with property is luck, and that there can be an important kind of what we might call a distributional ethics, okay? That, as I mentioned that earlier, that we have a moral obligation to kind of distribute resources, because property rights is really kind of more of a moral objection. So anyhow, I hope you kind of gain a basic understanding of this topic. As I said, if you want to listen to the varsity lecture, which incorporates some of this, but has a very wide kind of spread of arguments that are not really debated, especially at the novice level or on kind of local circuits, but and I think in some ways are kind of a little bit ridiculous sometimes, but there is a lecture that kind of covers the widespread, the wide kind of, the breadth of the topic, I guess I should say. Anyhow, I hope you enjoyed the lecture and that you consider subscribing to the website and gain access to all of our evidence and materials for the entire year for the prices that you see on the screen.